There's probably no subject that is more difficult to appreciate on a popular level than this rather dry and dismal problem of logic. Logic is an offense to most people because they much prefer to be illogical. They find logic a very frustrating thing, and the definitions available in dictionaries and standard reference works are either inadequate or utterly confusing. Yet actually, logic can be a very interesting subject if we begin to apply it to ourselves or try to gain some practical insight about the processes of the human mind. If we possess essential facts, there would be little use for either logic or reason. In fact, most of the branches of learning that we know today would be useless if we had a small group of inevitable, eternal facts available to our comprehension. We use the word fact today rather loosely. We use it to define anything which seems to be obviously and undeniably true. And we do have a small number of what might be termed trite facts. Facts that no one will ever question, but in themselves will contribute very little to our improvement, our happiness, or our security. Thus, there are so-called self-evident things which no one chooses to question or deny. Every once in a while, however, someone assails one of these self-evident things and has demonstrated that many of them can be successfully assailed. For example, it was a self-evident fact in the 13th and 14th century that the earth was flat. No one questioned it. Today, in the 20th century, we know the earth is geographically round and financially flat. But that is a little different from the original thinking. We know that people were burned at the stake, boiled in oil, ridiculed, and persecuted for affirming things that we now call to be facts. This can only have one essential meaning to us, namely that even obvious facts may not be factual. Realizing, as we must in philosophy, that we are dealing with a universe of values, most of these values essentially unknown, we must develop various means of self-orientation. If we cannot know that which is inevitably and eternally true, then we must deal with probabilities. We must deal with those beliefs and convictions and policies and attitudes which seemingly have the greatest amount of integrity and veracity in them. Logic comes to our aid in this particular type of emergency. Logic helps us to escape the tendency to develop what Epictetus calls a falling sickness of the mind. It prevents us from being imposed upon by common or vulgar errors. It prevents us from overlooking the more obvious hazards, difficulties, or inconsistencies in reports and so-called facts. Logic is of two kinds, generally broadly divided between pre-Aristotelian logic and post-Aristotelian logic. Post-Aristotelian logic was a systematic science of logic, built up by a very careful classification of processes and procedures and the perfection of logical instruments by means of which we were able to refine to a certain measure those common processes which we know as common sense. Logic was really formalized to press forward the conclusions of the individual on matters which he commonly regarded as normal, reasonable, probable, likely. Pre-Aristotelian logic was called natural logic, and natural logic is part of the wisdom of the folk. Natural logic is the shrewdness of the old farmer, the almost untutored skill of the village lawyer. At a time when books were few, problems were rather simple, the lawyer depended largely upon common sense, and so did the judge. In those days, the confusion of litigation as we know it today did not exist. And for the most part, justice was discovered by simple, rather ordinary procedures. Natural logic also helped the semi-civilized person to come to certain conclusions that were consistent with his general attainment. Natural logic, therefore, must have some bearing upon the capacity of the person to be logical. It was not a formal structure that could be passed on from one person to another and be universally true for all concerned. It was a kind of homely insight that developed around the natural thoughtfulness, the natural penetration of certain minds that seem to have special abilities in being thoughtful or reasonable or sequential or orderly in their thinking. Thus, in most communities, there were a few logical persons who were greatly called upon for their advice, their opinions on various matters of significance. Perhaps the most useful phase of logic for us is that it is related to the science of the reasonable. In every contact we have in life, we are challenged to determine within ourselves the reasonableness of situations. We are required to determine the reasonableness of the news that we read in the paper, the reasonableness of the explanations given to us by friends and associates for their various activities. We are expected also to be able to defend in a reasonable manner our own feelings, our own beliefs, our own attitudes on a variety of common issues. The enemy of the reasonable, of course, is not just merely thoughtlessness. It is largely pressure. One of the most common causes of unreasonableness is the desire of the person, we will say, to get something for nothing. This is a common affliction of our race, and never have we suffered from it more than at the present time. Never have we been so gullible. Never have we been so over-influenced by pretension. Never have we lost our common sense in the desperate desire to have things the way we want them to be, regardless of whether the way is reasonable or not. Logic is part of philosophy because it has to depend upon the development of certain philosophical instruments in consciousness. The person, to be logical, must have some framework or background of reasonableness. He must have some foundation in natural law. He must have some comprehension of the probabilities of existence. And having gained a basic knowledge of such principles, he must have the courage to apply them. And he must also have the memory necessary to bring them to attention at the proper time. Perhaps one of the simplest examples of this that we can advance quickly is the problem of Buddhist philosophy. Here we have a very complicated system which has passed through numerous reformations and changes based upon two laws: the law of causality, or cause and effect, and the law of rebirth, or reincarnation. To the Buddhist, these are real fixed points in thought. He builds his entire concept of life around them. Under the law of cause and effect and its manifestation as karma, he has been taught that he is not ever going to get something for nothing. He accepts this. He accepts it not only as a philosophical truth, as an ethical fact, as a moral reality, but as a spiritual inevitable. Now, we cannot say that it is possible to demonstrate to the ultimate degree of finality the factualness of the Buddhist position. We can accept it, we can reject it, we can admire it, we can dislike it. But we can only come to the point of saying that in the light of the structure of the philosophy itself, it is reasonable. Furthermore, in the light of human experience, it is reasonable. After all, we have all tried to get something for nothing. We have found it one of the most expensive procedures that there is. We have been disillusioned, deceived, and cheated hundreds of times in our efforts to build a universal value called a bargain. We know in our heart of hearts and our mind of minds that real bargains are extremely rare, and that to discover them at all requires a great deal of judgment. They can occur, but only under the most fortuitous circumstances. Thus, in the Buddhist concept, the individual is not looking for a bargain. If something comes to him a little more easily than might seem to be normally the probability, he begins to call on another one of his laws, or another phase of his law, to express this or to understand it, and that is the law of karma. He decides that perhaps he has earned a little better destiny than he thought, and therefore occasionally something unusually pleasant or agreeable occurs to him. On the general pattern, however, of a universe built upon the law of cause and effect, it is not difficult to build a fairly solid structure of logic. Nor is it so difficult to be logical about the life of the person if we accept the idea of reincarnation. But these are merely two examples, not to press the point, not to affirm that these are the best of all beliefs, but merely to point out that the individual, in order to develop logic, must have certain basic beliefs. He must have certain concepts that are large enough to satisfy him that they are true. And then he must apply to these the various developments of reasoning powers and experiences which occur, fitting that which happens into the pattern of that which he believes to be a reasonable universal plan. If he is able to do this, of course, he is protected against a great deal of imposition. And he is able to be logical in the terms of the basic beliefs that he holds. And this, of course, is more or less as far as logic can go. Logic is a way of proving a certain conviction, but it is not a way of proving that the conviction itself is true. Logic is to unfold a thing according to its premise. If it is consistent with its premise, it is logical. But this does not mean that it must be factual. But today, most people have fairly good premises. They move from reasonably well-developed common attitudes. These premises have been strengthened by education. They have been strengthened by the historical experience of our race, by tradition, by observation, by experimentation, and by what we term authority, which I regard as about the least of all, but it's still there. These foundations are available to us, and we can build logically in harmony with them. Also, we know that for a thing to be logical, there must be a relation between what happens to us and what happens to other people. Now, here is a bad example of logic. It is logical that good should come to us because we deserve it. It is illogical that good should come to others because they do not deserve it. Our assumption in this always is that we, by nature, are superior to others. That while it is perfectly reasonable and perfectly probable for another individual to be victimized by poor judgment, this is just not possible to us. We have a kind of infallibility in us. We can say when someone else is in trouble, it serves him right. But when the same trouble comes to us, to borrow a line from Kipling, the bottom is out of the universe. We no longer have any faith in anything. Thus, we are unable to realize or to admit that we all have the same fallibilities, that we are all subject to the same mistakes, and that therefore we have no right and no reason to assume that any attitude that we possess gives us immunity to the common events of life. So logic can help us. It can help us to build a universe around certain concepts. And certainly the law of cause and effect is one of these concepts. It is a concept that if we want something, we must earn it. And also that if we want $1, we must earn $1, not 50 cents. It is a concept that what we earn will ultimately come to us. And then we go into another level of logic. And we say to ourselves, what is the meaning of the whole concept of earning and paying? Certainly, we work hard. We gain certain goods or chattels for our labor. These goods we spend or trade or do something with to gain other ends that we want. But what is the meaning of it all? After a lifetime of barter and exchanging, we depart into a universe which, according to the opinions of our philosophers and theologians, will not be devoted to bartering and exchanging. That most of the things we do here are peculiarly related to this kind of life. So it is perfectly reasonable to ask the question, why do we spend 70 years here doing things we may never do again? Now, this is a kind of a sticky question. Now, if we're materialists, there is no answer. There's not only no answer, but there's no reason why we should have lived here in the first place. If we are theologians and believe that we are going to drift off into some paradisical abode where we will spend eternity with the angels, this may also be optimism, but it gives us no real incentive for becoming skillful merchants, good mechanics, does not even give us any particular reason for any art unless it be music, and we are stuck with a harp sometime. But outside of this, there is no reason for it. Rebirth tells us, well, perhaps we'll come back and need these skills again. But the question then naturally arises, how many of these skills will be in survival by the time we come back? Will we be working hard to perfect a capitalistic system to find that we return 1,000 years from now and capitalism is extinct? What do we know about these things? So we ask ourselves all kinds of questions. Children ask. We do not know the absolute answer. We hope we have a reasonable answer. But if someone turns around, picks a hole in our answer, and discomforts us because we are unable to demonstrate our point, then we have been deficient in logic in the development of our solution or our approach to the matter. We have to have not only things that are reasonable, but things which can be demonstrated or manifested to the best of our rational ability. So logic is the means by which we put our ideas into neat little packages, label them, and have them available when we need them. Ideas which will influence us and which we can communicate in an articulate manner to others. This is especially a responsibility of parents to children. The answers that they give children must be logical, and they must be reasonable. The child may not be able to distinguish the reasonable elements, but most children can discover the lack of logic, and they will turn right around and ask the inevitably embarrassing question. This type of thing discomforts parents, but what it should point out to the parent is that he never had the answer, and that his own need is as great as that of the child. He has been drifting along without any clear, reasonable explanation for the very problem the child is bringing to attention. And it's very apt to be a key problem, a basic problem, and a very valuable one. So logic inspires the person to make sure that his own answers, his own thinking, his own solution to problems are not only reasonable, but in the lines of consistency are defensible in a world of doubting friends, relatives, and neighbors. The problem of logic means that we must face the logic of other people. They tell us something we disagree with. There is no use in disagreeing. There is no use in shouting. There is no use in sulking. We must have a better answer, or the other person's logic stands, whether we like it or not. If he is logical, if he has developed his premises correctly, if we are unable to find any flaw in the unfoldment of his basic ideas, then we must either agree with him or become better students ourselves in order that we may find flaws that normally we would overlook. So that logic helps us to straighten out, clarify, simplify, and direct both thought and word. Logic helps us to put into a concise statement our ideas about a matter. One thing we observe in logical people is that they very often lack imagination, that they are perhaps too concise, that they are uninteresting because they approach everything in such a peculiarly realistic way that they manage to take most of the romance and drama out of life. This, again, is because they have had too much Aristotelian logic and have never found that the development of the logical faculty is a very beautiful, interesting, dramatic, dynamic thing. They have become logy in it. They have become bound by rules only, until the rules have become more important than the ideas. All rules exist merely in order to clarify ideas. The rule is not the important thing. It is merely the frame by means of which the picture gains new dignity. And to substitute the rule for the picture, or the frame for the picture, is to become a pedant, to become this type of mind that was so criticized in the Middle Ages, which we call today the scholastic, and which at an earlier time the Greeks called sophists, meaning today in our thinking those pedants whose knowledge was more apparent than real. Logic in our daily working with problems can always gain some help by the generalization of particular ideas. Today we have to realize that we live in a world with billions and 3 billions of other people. And therefore that in some way any attitude that we have, any belief that we hold, must have a fairness about it, must have a larger integrity in it. It cannot be a private idea. We cannot live in private worlds ruled over by a private set of laws which we have invented, defended by a small army consisting only of our own faculties, and perpetuated regardless of the evidence against it that may accumulate in the world around us. We cannot have these private worlds. When we are unable to be big enough and broad enough to escape from these private worlds, we retire into them under pressure and become introverts. Very often the introvert is simply a person who does not want to live in the world as it is, but in a private universe of his own. Now, if he stays there, refuses to come out, he may remain in this private universe for his entire lifetime. He may populate it with his own kind of gods and godlings. He may make his own rules to run it. He may decree who he will permit and who he will not permit to be a citizen of his private world. In the end, however, he generally has no citizens but himself. This kind of attitude, while perhaps not carried to this extreme, is a common failing. We like to feel a certain power to interpret things as we want to. This is all right up to a certain point. Beyond that, it is a form of self-hypnosis or self-over-suggestion in which we gradually force a dignity upon our opinions which they do not really deserve. So we have to say to ourselves when we take attitudes, what would happen if these attitudes became general? Immanuel Kant, in his categorical imperative, gives us a good example of this policy. He tries to place a criterion upon man's concepts and precepts. He says, for example, that the final test of everything is that a belief of ours, fully matured and developed and unfolded according to all of its potential, if the code by which we live, the production of our own thinking and feeling, if this code became universal and all men had to live under this exact code, would there be universal justice? If there isn't, then our own code is wrong. In other words, if our code is not a code that we could live under, if it was administered by another person rather than ourselves, then things are not good with us. If we cannot create a way of life which is fair to all men, it is not fair to us. And it may be an expedient thing which we cannot immediately change, but it is not an ultimate, nor is it something greatly to be desired. We must always attempt the universalization of our attitude to see whether we would like to live under such a system. This is almost another statement of the Golden Rule. which occurs in over 40 religions and philosophies. It is simply a statement of the idea that would we really want others to do to us what we are moved to do to them? If we feel like taking advantage of them, would we be just as happy if they took advantage of us in the same way? If we would not, then we shouldn't start it, because the law of cause and effect will move in. So logic finally helps us to live in such a way that we can be happy under the law of cause and effect. It teaches us to sow wisely in order that we may reap happily. It tells us to plant what we expect to harvest, and that we will not have a harvest contrary to the planting. It also warns us to guard the crop carefully during the difficult periods of its growth. For if we neglect the harvest, we will diminish the fullness thereof. It places the universe under a pattern of law. If we do not want to be lied to, we do not lie. If we do not want to be exploited, we do not exploit. If we do not want to be deceived, we do not deceive. If we do not want to be neglected, we do not neglect. We take it for basic fact, as far as we are able to extend fact, that it is extremely logical and reasonable that the things that we do will have inevitable consequences in us, and we must be prepared to live by them. Now, why and how shall we demonstrate this? Logic again comes forward. If we assume this concept of sowing and reaping to be just, how can we logically defend it? We can defend it in a great many ways. We can defend it in the common ground of all logic. First, we can defend it mentally, where we are able to prove by straight thinking that this is true in justice. This is true in man-made law. This is true in every experience that we know. We gain further support from it by the observation of natural phenomena around us. We observe the various habits of creatures. We recognize the wisdom of the ancient saying, waste not, want not. We know that this is part of the folk wisdom of our people. History can give us terrible examples of those who have broken these simple rules. So by degrees we build up a very powerful defensive structure. This is not pure logic, but this is what might be termed natural logic. It is the kind of logic which guided the conduct of our ancestors. We can, however, by the skillful use of words, formularize all these facts into simple, direct statements. These direct statements appear in themselves to be beyond controversy. They cannot be denied. The sequence of them must therefore come to a reasonable and inevitable conclusion, and that conclusion is logical. Now, there's no reason why everyone should spend the rest of their time trying to work out logical theorems or make use of the Aristotelian categories in order to arrive at certain conclusions that they want. The problem is largely the preservation in modern man of natural logic, the simple homespun variety, the kind that is the wisdom of the young which will confound the old on many occasions. We can gradually develop a kind of common sense which, if we are mindful of it and continuously live according to it, will take out of our lives many of the unpleasant incidents with which we are afflicted. We can remember certain very simple formulas in the working of these problems. We can say to ourselves, a certain man has cheated us. This man, in turn, has cheated others. And we must therefore come to the logical conclusion that he is not honest. And on the basis of this conclusion, we must be on guard against him at all times. Now, this is not so difficult if we are quiet and in an impersonal mood, but you'd be surprised at the stream of younger people who come to me who have made illogical marriages. Not because they were not students of Aristotle, but because they lacked ordinary common sense. A person under the glamour of romance, for example, will come and tell me frankly that she has become smitten by a young man who has been for years a chronic alcoholic. This individual has never been able to keep a job, and he has a bad police record. But she feels that in spite of all this, he is a good man, basically, and that she is going to be able to reform him in 10 easy lessons. Now, by this we have a good example of bad logic. She is not going to accomplish such a thing. The testimonies are against her. The testimonies indicate that in her emotional attachment, she has lost sight of nearly all of the essential facts. Another individual comes to me with a business problem. He has a man with whom he is closely associated in business. In a number of personal affairs which have arisen in their lives, matters largely of friendship or social relations or incidental things, the man who came to me learned several matters about his business associate. First, he learned that he was a tax evader. He learned that he chiseled in every way possible and was perfectly willing to perjure himself on his tax return. But my friend said, well, after all, taxes are not very fair, so I don't blame him. Maybe I'd do the same thing. A little later, he found that this man had a beautiful congenital habit of lying. Whenever he was in a difficulty, he lied. When he didn't want to do something, he lied. The lies were mostly comparatively harmless. They were just nice little white lies, but they were getting a little gray with constant wear. He also found out that this individual was perfectly willing to drive a sharper bargain than the facts justified. That this individual was perfectly willing to misrepresent products. He was perfectly willing to promise delivery of goods that he could not deliver, not because he wasn't supported and backed by the firms with whom he dealt, but he knew they were slow of delivery. He knew that he could not promise these things, yet he promised, fully aware that he could not keep his word. Little by little, the man who came to me got an impression of this man that was pretty bad. But after having this impression built up and sustained for several years, he was never able to understand why this man suddenly cheated him. There was just no other probable outcome. Logically, reasonably, this man would ultimately cheat anybody for the fact that he had this kind of a basic disposition. But because he was friendly, because he was affable, because he was good-intentioned, apparently, the people with whom he dealt were off guard and were seriously imposed upon. Now, anyone who has the tendency to think straight can avoid these kinds of problems. He can also avoid problems of excessive debt. He can guard against allowing his emotions or his appetites to cause him to take on unreasonable responsibilities that he cannot meet. If he sat down and figured out the law of probabilities, he would be in a much stronger position than he is under his present way of thinking. One man came to me who had a little more of the logical attitude within himself. I think he wanted me to help him to be illogical, but I couldn't oblige. What he was explaining to me was that he was buying a house. Actually, he was buying a house that was way out of his financial class. He was buying a house, and he sat down with me and he figured it out. He says, it is going to take me 20 years to pay for this house. And in order to pay for it, and to maintain my family in a reasonable security, I cannot be sick for one day or out of work for one day in that entire period of time. Is it probable that I can make this transaction safely? The answer, of course, it isn't. It isn't so. He would have to have some backlog to protect him. If this man had enough additional funds to maintain himself for 2 years, at any time during the period under consideration, he might have taken the chance. As it was far too dangerous. Yet most people would never stop and think of this. They think of only the refinancing, or the possibility of bluffing their way through, or the even more dangerous situation of ending up with various indebtedness on which they're paying from 12 to 20% per annum. People just will not sit down and quietly put 2 and 2 together and get 4 as the result. So if we can train mind just a partial way along this thinking things through policy, then we find that there are many simple rules, simple guides, simple ways by which we can protect ourselves against unusual and unreasonable stress. Wherever we do not make this protective move, where we do not think these things through, we hazard not only our security, our happiness, our friends, but we also hazard our health. The individual, having made unreasonable moves and forced to defend them in one way or another, may pay with his life for the additional anxiety that he has brought upon himself. So the philosophical pattern here, the great value of philosophy, is that it shall cause prudence, that it will not restrict the person in the reasonable fulfillment of reasonable desires, but will prevent him from taking on unreasonable futures which he may not be able to meet. This philosophical pattern will prevent him from mortgaging years that are not yet his. These principles will help him to be able to sit down quietly and reason through the intensities of his own desires, reason through the pressures of his own ambitions, and try to arrive at a course of action which is defensible in terms of common sense. If he can do this, he will not have too many difficulties. So what we call natural logic is that the person shall have normal expectancy as to the outcome of the various things or patterns with which he is concerned. He will set something in motion with a full awareness of the responsibilities and the opportunities. That he will accept debt advisedly, knowing that sometimes he must accept it. But he will never abuse the privilege of owing money. He will never go so far in a situation that he endangers all because he must have something. This type of discipline takes philosophy out of the realm of abstraction, where we have tried to keep it in the cloistered sanctuaries of universities, and puts it to work where it belongs, in the daily existence of individuals who must defend themselves in this particular generation against a wild array of illogical and unreasonable pressures. The individual must become more quiet as the world becomes noisier. He must become more careful as the world grows more careless. He must compensate for every dereliction of society by a further intensification of his own integrity. Otherwise, he is ultimately going to be drowned in a sea of common mistakes. Now, when we come to sum up this problem of logic and of the reasonable, we must naturally flow with it into the next branch of philosophical study, and this is ethics. Now, ethics is concerned primarily with two problems, but before we approach them directly, we know that ethics must seek the definition of morality. Ethics has to do with the nature of moral good and moral bad. Now, this problem is hardly less complicated than the one involving logic. And it is somewhat more difficult because good and bad emotionalize so rapidly and rationalize so slowly. The whole problem of good and bad is extremely relative and has been subject to more ramifications and changes in the course of human history than perhaps any other basic concept. However, in the basic definition, morality must be that by means of which individual conduct contributes the most to collective security. Morality must have to do with the individual's concept of what is right. And what is right must be a positive statement of value. Morality then does break down into the two divisions which I mentioned. Morality being, first of all, what is the present good? How are we to approach the problem of contemporary value? But morality goes a step beyond this. For morality must define the nature of future good, because it is only by the definition of future good that civilization grows. Without a vision of something better than it is, everything fails. Thus, we must have not only a nature of good as we know it, but of better as it could be, or as the future naturally implies, a reasonable growth. This growth being a growth not only in a state, but in value. So we can say that ethics has to do with the basic problem of value. It has to do with decision as to that which is most necessary and the greater good. And it therefore is the type of decision which may cause the patriot to sacrifice his life for his principle. It may cause the parent to sacrifice more slowly the years of life for the protection of the child. It may be the conviction which causes the person to depart from worldliness, dedicate himself to some missionary endeavor, and bury his life in some jungle or swamp. These are values. Values which we find expressed on every level of human activity. So we now consider first the problem of ethics as an effort to determine the nature of morality. Now, today we think of morality almost entirely on the emotional level of physical human relationships. This is not according to philosophy. Morality, according to philosophy, is actually motivation. Morality is the reason behind conduct. And whatever we do, are we motivated by the principal powers or values that we associate with ethics? Are we motivated by integrity? Are we motivated by virtue? Are we motivated by the fact that what we plan to do is necessary, useful, proper, and therefore generally commendable? Morality includes the element of mental and emotional integrity and physical honesty. Honesty is the long physical shadow of integrity. And many persons who are honest from fear only. They are not persons of basic integrity. Morality, then, has to do with whether or not we shall compromise value for any reason, for any consideration. Logic would say, don't compromise it because it is unreasonable. Ethics would say, do not compromise because compromise is not good. We move now from the standard of the reasonable and the practical to the standard which is largely dominated by the function of the human conscience. Good becomes to the individual his standard of action. If his standard of action is too low, then it is obvious through his conduct because he is not good. So each person has to determine in his own way a standard of morality. And it will involve a large number of different activities. One of the most common decisions he has to make is the degree to which he will compromise integrity to utility. This is the great question of today. It is a question that is faced in every field of human activity. It is faced by everyone seeking employment. It is faced by nearly everyone who has a job. It is a decision that comes frequently into the home. It has much to do with the fact we have or do not have friends. And it may have a great deal to do with the bank balance. These problems are problems of ethics, and they are problems which involve primarily the degree to which we are willing to sacrifice advantage to the maintenance of principle. Well, this question is open to very large debate. The general tendency of people today is to give it less and less attention. And a person will consider himself as reasonably virtuous if he is as honest as conditions permit. And, of course, with conditions permitting less and less, he is not gaining very much in moral stature with the passing of time. Now, each person has the decision to make. And the problem of the ethical life of the individual is summed up in philosophy in a very simple manner. And yet this simple manner is far greater instrument than we realize. Namely, that each individual must live in a way in which he can live with himself without stress. This does not mean that all persons are going to be able to make all ethical adjustments immediately. To the average person, the problem of ethics and the problem of morality both are related to a relationship between the individual and his own life. For example, a person belonging to a religious group may be instructed by this group, as some are, that it is a moral sin to turn on a television, a radio. It is a moral sin to go to a theater or a dance, and it is a moral sin to read romantic or non-religious literature. That puts the lid down pretty tight on this person. So his problem then is, how does he feel about it? If he has assumed this faith, if he is convinced that the faith is true, if he has voluntarily committed himself to what he regards as the deepest religious principles that are possible to him, he is by this act committing himself to the rules of that organization or group. If he is sincere, whether he is reasonable or not, if he is devout, whether he is sensible or not, he cannot break the rules which he affirms to be true without damage to his own character. This is the inevitable product of the conflict in ethical standards. It means, therefore, that anything of a moral nature which offends the individual is going to damage him. In some instances, the individual has gone directly to the organization and resigned, as making a statement that he is no longer in favor of it. But if the organization is religious and he has taken certain sacramental obligations, the question is, can he resign from his vows? That is a very much more difficult one. It is done. It has been done frequently. But what is the result upon the person? Is this individual damaging himself? Is his emancipation of such a nature that he is able to realize that he was mistaken in his previous allegiance? Is he able to sense that perhaps he is breaking an obligation which was taken in terms of a belief that is not true? Even presuming this to be so, can he break an obligation that he has taken to himself? This is a strong moral problem. There is no trite answer, because the individual has to live with himself. And out of the mystery of his own conscience must come finally that which he can do and that which he cannot do. Now, in addition to the private opinion or the private conviction of the individual, the world has built up gradually a collective pattern of ethics. This collective pattern has been contributed to by nearly all of the surviving civilizations and many that have not survived. The great descent of man's concept of morality and ethics constitutes one of the most powerful of our psychological heritages. We have gradually built most of our morality around Scripture, most of our ethics around philosophy. Yet in this phase of the problem, they are essentially identical. The only difference being that while our ethical assumptions or our ethical convictions may be defended by a certain reasonableness, either logic or other instrument of philosophy, our moral or religious allegiances can be defended by faith only, or by the mysterious factor of intense realization or intuition or inspirational guidance. Therefore, morality rapidly moves toward the metaphysical, whereas ethics remains very largely in the realm of physics, a kind of metaphysical physics, but in a more material sense. Morality, therefore, can be traditional, and it can be highly personal. But we do have certain standards, and civilized nations must live within the general patterns of these standards. And where the individual diverges too far from the morality and ethics of his time, he is subject to censure. Now, this censure may take many forms, but it nearly always results in some misfortune, some difficulty or unpleasantness, which the offender must accept, and which may gradually work a hardship upon him. Within any structure of ethics, however, we also must continue to recognize the unethical person. We realize that any traditional form can come in violation with individual attitudes, and that therefore what we call crime, which is the violation of the laws of men, or sin, which is theologically a violation of the laws of God, that both of these exist and have existed from the dawn of time, and that actually in matters of both crime and sin there has been comparatively little progress. There has been a certain refinement, but these two values have not been advanced as rapidly as our skills or attitudes on other subjects. So that today, as far as our moral and ethical lives are concerned, we are making precisely the same mistakes as our most remote ancestors. The only difference being that we are making them in a rather more sophisticated manner. Perhaps this in itself is an indication of lost ground, because it is assumed that increasing intelligence should have given us greater control of our own conduct. Morality, then, as a practical subject, has to do with the individual gaining emotional control over conduct. Ethics with his gaining mental control over attitudes. Both of these have their very obvious and very practical expressions in human society. And nearly everyone who is interested in advancing himself, gaining a better attitude toward life, freeing himself from old fears and doubts and anxieties, and gaining a sense of integration in life and into the life of the universe, must try in some way or other to discover principles which will guide his ethical and moral convictions, and at the same time not offend his intelligence. This is not always easy, but gradually systems of philosophy have accomplished this. We know that for the most part, the world's greatest heroes, those for whom we have the greatest admiration, regarding them as the noblest of human beings, have been outstanding examples of constructive morality and ethics. We know also that great systems of religion are in relative agreement as to what constitutes morality. Great systems of philosophy are in relative agreement as to what constitutes ethics. And even on the material plane of life, where ethics is most apt to be violated, the ethical structure of society holds ethics to be desirable, to be necessary, to be proper, and regrets the loss of ethical integrity, even though it does not support that integrity. So each person does have a reference frame, and this reference frame must be in terms of time and place. And the reference frame makes available to him the best ethics that the world has known. It makes available to him the highest concepts of morality which man has achieved. And it presents these truths, or these realities, or these concepts in the most persuasive and reasonable way, pointing out the proven dangers of transgressing these standards. The simplest attitude that we know of, perhaps, in ethics, is found in the recommendation or admonition of Jesus as to what constitutes the law and the prophets. Namely, that we shall love God and live honestly with our fellow men. This constitutes what might be termed natural morality and ethics. If we love a spiritual principle, we are again reminded of the words, "If you love me, keep my commandments." To love God is to live according to our conviction of what God requires. To claim to love, and at the same time to go contrary to this claim, is not only to subject us to inconsistency, it is going to subject us to conflict within ourselves, causing sickness. I believe we will demonstrate in the ages that lie ahead, somewhere along the line, that a very large part of sickness, for which we now give innumerable possible causes, actually arise. These various types of sickness arise in man's inner conflict between his conviction and his conduct. If this could be completely cleared out within himself, it is quite likely that he would live longer and live more happily, have more energy and better health, inasmuch as all of his resources are involved in the subtle condemnation of himself, which he practices whether he admits it or not. And under pressure, nearly always, the lack of ethics, the lack of morality, will bring further hazards, which cause again further concern, until the individual collapses in the responsibilities of his own mistakes. So we think of ethics and morality not only as virtues of the spirit and of the mind, but necessary guides of conduct and action if we wish to have the maximum value out of the physical life that we live. So we can say now that morality for the individual is based upon a series of attitudes or a series of concepts which are developed rather broadly and deeply in Neoplatonism. Certain values have a common nature in the universe. The various manifestations of universal law give different expressions to an identical group of values. These values interpreting themselves in many, many ways. For example, one of the ways in which things which are reasonable manifest themselves may be termed orderly. A thing is orderly, in which the parts of itself are in proper relationships to each other. A thing is in order when there is no longer any disorder in it. And this lack of disorder actually means that there is no conflict in it, no disagreement in it, no asymmetry within the structure of that thing. So that which is termed orderly may also be termed reasonable. Because when we achieve an orderly state of the mind, we are reasonable. When we achieve a reasonable state of the virtues, we are moral. When we achieve a moral state in relation to certain specialized fields, such as, for example, the arts, we discover that morality and virtue suddenly manifest as beauty. Beauty is only another name for this same orderliness that we started out with. Beauty is everything in its proper relationship to everything else. Now, we may say that standards of beauty differ with various peoples, but this is true almost exclusively because of familiarity. We give a certain acceptance to things familiar. But at the same time, these familiar things must be acceptable to our standards of aesthetics and integrity. So virtue, beauty, goodness, love, faith, hope, all of these different terms more or less represent the manifestations of one principle in various areas of activity. And that which is beautiful is harmonious. That which is harmonious is ethical. Then we have a scientific sequences. We have scientific types of order, as we represent it in the magnificent universal geometry manifested in snowflakes. We say that a snowflake is a magnificent example of universal order. Because it is this, it is beautiful. Because of it being a representation of universal order, it must be good. Because that which is manifested according to its universal has to be good. It is when it is distorted away from its universal that it ceases to be good. So we are dealing with all kinds of patterns. We are dealing with musical harmonies. For the Greeks were very quick to point out that musical discords were immoral, and that the individual who permitted himself to be influenced by them would destroy part of his own integration. Now, whether they are fashionable, whether everybody likes them, or whether they give a certain unreasonable stimulation to jaded nerves, the fact remains that discords are not good. And that which is not good does not produce good. And that which is not good, when brought into contact with the consciousness of the individual, hurts that individual. And if this not good remains too frequently as an oppression upon the spirit of the individual, his own moral nature is injured as a result. We may say the same thing of various color harmony. An asymmetrical work of art is not good. That which by its nature is without morality, by its implication is without ethics, by its structure is without order, and by its color or form is without harmony. This thing is not good. Now we have no longer the Pythagorean attitude that inanimate things can influence us. Yet we know they do, regardless of whether we admit it or not. We know that the environment in which we live may be inanimate, but it is an influencing factor. We know that our profession is not a living entity, yet it will change our character. And we must also always point out that we can be and are constantly under the pressure of various abnormal situations. So in our ethics, we have to realize that there is ethical and non-ethical art. This brings us to another point. Can we use three terms here? Can we say ethical, unethical, non-ethical? We have used this conveniently in recent years in various ways. We say moral, immoral, and amoral. We use various terms to indicate a neutrality between the extremes. The purpose of this neutrality being to deprive the subject discussed of any value, assuming that it can be neutral. That we can say that a thing has neither good nor bad meaning. Therefore, that it has no meaning. But we are not in nature able to demonstrate that anything that exists has no meaning. We have no way of demonstrating that any situation, condition, or quality that arises can be neutral. even though we may try to make it so. Everything must finally verge toward the good or the bad. It cannot be completely in equilibrium. We're reminded again of the good words of the Holy Book, namely that which is neither hot nor cold the Lord speweth out of his mouth. And this is the problem of all this so-called equilibrium situation, a situation in which the individual feels free to express himself in any way that he wishes to because he does not put a directive upon that expression. He doesn't have to. The expression itself has to be direct. Therefore, he must take responsibility for the directive regardless of whether he is willing to assume that responsibility or not. He cannot say, as some parents do, we can lie among ourselves, but the children must tell the truth. He cannot say this. He cannot say that he is using a non-directive line because he is advising the children not to lie. He cannot escape the fact that whatever attitude he takes has a directive. And in this world there is no person so humble or so ignorant or so perverse that he does not have at least two disciples in the course of living. Someone is going to copy him. Someone is going to use him as a standard, whether he is high or low on the level of human affairs. So we cannot avoid the idea of the final ethical and moral results of conduct. Therefore, we must dismiss also the amoral, non-ethical universe which we have been trying so desperately to maintain. There is not one single thing in nature that does not affect any creature that is conscious of that thing. We may assume there are forces or situations that do not affect us because we do not know of their existence. They may affect us subjectively, however. Of this we are not sure. But one thing we do know is that the sunrise and the sunset, the full moon and the new moon, the rising and setting of the stars, the sounds of both man and nature, the architecture around us, the various processes and policies which we create, the clothing we wear, the food we eat, the attitudes we hold, the attitudes that others hold to us, all of these things and an infinite diversity of other things, all affect us. All affecting us in terms of strengthening morality and ethics or tearing down morality and ethics, causing the individual to verge toward the good or away from the good. And life as a total experience is made up of these innumerable pressures, which in some way must come into a summary. They must finally form one compound. And this compound then becomes, we may say, the symbol of the total result of living. We have advanced a little by innumerable and diverse courses, or we have retarded ourselves a little by one group of factors or another. But every individual coming out of this life at the end of an embodiment leaves this world a little better or a little worse than he enters it. No one leaves in a completely neutral condition. No one takes out precisely what he brought in and no more and no less, because he cannot survive over a period of years without in some way being affected. Thus, we know that morality and ethics constitute continuous challenges to our integrity and to our values. And we then try to find simple ways of applying some of these challenges to the obvious associations of daily living. The individual, as Plotinus points out in his essay on the beautiful, requires various types of nutrition to support his life. Plato, again, in the Banquet of Olympiodorus, gives us the same general thinking. Man exists only because of nutrition. His entire manifestation is due to the fact that there is enough fuel provided to enable him to continue in various functions. This fuel is not all of one kind, any more than the fuel used in a very elaborate machine may be all of one kind, as in a combustion motor where at least 2 or 3 kinds of ingredients or fuels or materials are necessary to maintain the efficiency of the device. Each person, therefore, as Plotinus points out, must receive nutrition. He receives it in many, many ways. He receives it from the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth beneath his feet. He receives the magnetic currents of nature, which are invisible to him, but which must certainly be nutritional to certain invisible parts of his own composition. He lives in a universe of energies, to which he responds in varying degrees according to his nature and constitution. In addition to these factors, he has 3 obvious forms of nutrition necessary to the maintenance of his physical existence, not as a body, but as a person in a body. In other words, the personality, the character, the temperament, the compound thing we call the individual in the material world must have 3 basic types of nutrition. He must have physical food. If this physical food is diluted, polluted, or corrupted, he will be sick and or die. If this food is not available, he will starve. If this food is not of proper quality or is inordinately indulged in, he will ultimately destroy himself. Therefore, immoderation in all things is destruction. He must therefore have proper food of a proper kind, under proper conditions, and in proper amounts. This food must be good food. By good food, we come into a moral question now. It must be honorably produced, honorably prepared. There must be no adulteration or chemicalization or evasion of good or pure food and drug laws. Anything that contaminates the food contaminates the body and injures it. And we are rather careful in this because we do not, any of us, particularly want to die of ptomaine poisoning. We do the best we can and grumble at the fact there is so little we can do in comparison to what we believe would be an ideal diet. The second thing that we have to have, as Plotinus tells us, is nutrition for other parts of the life. What food is to the body, beauty is to the psychic integration. The individual must receive a continuous nutrition of harmony, beauty, order, morality, and symmetry. He must be exposed continuously to the affirming within himself, or the restoring within himself, of the supply of idealism for which the soul is in continuous need. If the soul receives contaminated food, it sickens. If the food is too bad, the soul, as far as its function for man is concerned, may be said to die, although it does not actually perish. But it is sickened unto death. And any food which destroys the harmony of the soul, destroys man's ability to be a well-organized, well-ordered, happily adjusted human being. So every day, just as man takes in food, so must he likewise take in beauty. Now, the Chinese have a very interesting policy about this, which, while it is not necessary to our thinking entirely, shows that even 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, the Chinese, like the Greeks, were aware of this. And they tried to work it out in a very simple matter of food symbolism itself. The Chinese say that a meal placed in front of you must be nutritious. That is, it must be composed of food that is well prepared, nourishing, properly grown, and properly ripened, and properly diversified to provide a balanced ration. Now, this is all utility, and the result could be a kind of an emaciated-looking hash of some nature. Might have everything in it, but it would not be especially palatable. But the Chinese says that no matter how nutritious the food is, if it is not beautiful to the eyes, it is fake. The individual must find beauty in the food. He must look at the plate and he must say, this is a lovely meal. This is a magnificent bit of still life. This is something that I enjoy looking at. And because I enjoy looking at it, I'm going to digest it better. The third thing he says, I am now going to take a bite of this food. My sense of taste must be pleased. The food I eat must be an adventure of some nature that is delightful. The food must have quality. It must have texture. Some of it must be crisp. Some of it must be soft. Some of it must be smooth. Some might require a certain amount of condiment. Others, we want only the natural flavor without anything added. Flavor must be protected. To the Chinese, the most dismal thing in the whole world is overcooked food, cooked into a stew in which there is nothing left. The next thing that the Chinese like in connection with it is that it must smell good. It must be attractive to the sense perceptions. And they even go so far as to have all kinds of food products that sound good. You can hear the crisp and the crackle and the snapple of these foods and all these things. The Chinese says that when your five senses are equally pleased, the meal is well prepared, the food is nutritious, the environment is good, that there is no greater way of ensuring health, and that there is no way in which an individual can dig his grave more definitely and more distinctly than by shoveling in a mass of material which neither pleases him nor delights his soul, and for all he knows may not even nourish his body. So the Chinese tries to get at it all in the meal. But he does add conversation. He does add a pleasant atmosphere. He does point out that the service is good. It helps to make this whole thing an experience of the soul, which is fulfilling of artistry and all these things. Now, this can be done very simply. It doesn't have to be as elaborate as the Chinese thing. But the Chinese is right when he says, you must plan it, you must eat it thoughtfully, you must enjoy it, it must be important, or ultimately it will do you no good. In the Greek theory, after you got to the point of beauty, where every day the soul must be fed with art, with good music, with literature, with kindly associations with nature, a few moments in the garden, a view out over the ocean, to look at a beautiful picture, to read a beautiful poem, to meditate upon some kindly and learned work. or to find some great grace and beauty in the words of the saint and the sage and the Savior. These are the experiences of every day. If we do not have them, something dries up in us. Something becomes deformed, distorted, until we are no longer beautiful people. And then, as the Greeks pointed out, the mind must also be fed. To feed the mind with prejudice is like feeding the body with tainted food. It is going to sicken the mind. To feed the mind gossip is like feeding it food which has no nutritional value. Nothing is going to come out of it, only waste and residue that is of no value. To feed the mind a superficial thing is to try to live in the kind of a world in which we would feed the body nothing but French pastry and hope it would survive. There has to be solid mental food of thought, food of reflection, food that comes from the rational consideration of the values and problems of life, the food of philosophy, the food of science, the food of education. These things have to be provided. And if the personality with its three major parts is not so sustained by a balanced nutrition, it becomes sick. And Socrates points out that the first sickness that the soul exhibits is the deterioration of its morality and ethics. Just as surely as the body begins to function badly if its nutrition is in some way destroyed or perverted, so man, deprived of the total diet necessary to his integrity, is injured first in the most subtle parts of himself. The body may go on because he may be stuffing it with enough calories to hold it up, or he may be taking enough supplementary vitamins to get by on. But you can't do this. You can feed the emotion sophistications, which might seem like vitamins. You can feed the mind systems of brittle thinking, which might seem to be stimulants. But at the same time, the mind, unless it is given the food upon which mind grows naturally, and the emotions, unless they are given the nutrition which helps emotions to mature, deepen, and enrich, unless these values are provided, the individual begins to deteriorate from the top down. He deteriorates first in the compromising of his ethics. He deteriorates in his indifference to learning. This gradually results in antisocial attitudes of all kinds, the loss of respect for himself and for others, and the gradual development of an excessive criticism that is not controllable. If his aesthetics or his moral life is not enriched, it is impoverished. And the individual who has a rich, deep understanding of harmony will not do things which are discordant, asymmetrical, or emotionally wrong. But where he has no education, no culture, no insight into value, he has no basis for the recognition of true value in beauty, in friendship, in love, or in any other subtle emotional relationship which must depend upon the intuitive power of the emotions to recognize the beautiful and the good. If he has this inner nutrition, he will not become a delinquent. But if this nutrition is lacking within himself, he will. Confucius gives us this formula so wonderfully. He points out that everyone says to young people or to older people, be good, do what is right, this you must do, this you must not do. And the scriptures of the world are burdened with thou shalt nots from the beginning to the end. But this is not the answer. It is like telling the child not to eat what it wants. The answer does not lie in this building of high banks and barriers against conduct. The decision, the real solution lies in building within the individual a total concept of integrity. So Confucius said, if you want a man to be honest in his dealings, teach him music. It will change him inside himself. If you want him to be a good husband, teach him poetry. If you want him to be a kindly father, teach him philosophy. If you want him to be a good workman, give him religious insight. Don't go after the detail that you want him to be, but make him a totally bigger person inside. And if you do this, he will be a totally better person on the outside. You cannot prevent this modification of his own life. So if we want to make these changes, which we realize would be a little helpful now and then, if we want more courage, we must cultivate these values. Now, as most philosophy has demonstrated, these values are corrective of the excesses against which they have been properly contrived or built up. The individual, for example, who is selfish, has lost symmetry of soul. If he gains beauty of soul through the enrichment of his emotional experience on all reasonable levels, particularly in aesthetics, this individual, as his appreciation grows for that which is truly beautiful, inevitably becomes less selfish. The individual who has discovered great beauty is like the Chinese, who, having discovered the infinite wonder of Tao, has very few desires as far as possessions go. He is not controlling himself. He is not going without because he must decide between virtue and vice. But he suddenly discovers in the cultivation of beauty that selfishness is simply foolish. But the only things he can ever really own are the things which are in his own consciousness and which can never be taken from him. So as before he might have been trying to gather up a little comfort from the world, he goes out and sits quietly under a tree and shares the eternal comfort of the universe. All changes within the individual therefore lessen negative intensities. And as he grows in morality and ethics by the quiet encouragement of these things, he becomes a totally better person. And that is one of the reasons why, for so many years, we have been doing everything possible to interest people in music, in art, in fine things outside of religion and philosophy on which their minds have become so set. They are trying so hard to be good and to be wise that they do not realize that this beauty that they need and this wisdom that they desire will grow within themselves by the almost effortless effort that is Taoism itself. The simple, increasing love of beauty, the recognition of nobility, the quiet enjoyment of gentle learning. These things are the medicines and the foods by which the inner life of man matures and perfects itself. The man who loves beauty does not need to fear death. He may not be able to take his pictures and his paintings and his etchings with him, but he will take with him the power to enjoy universal beauty. The man who loves music may not be able to take the old violin with him, but he will be able to be quiet wherever he is in space and hear the music of the field. So all these great values enrich the inner life, and in so doing confer upon man the benefits of an immortal existence which will be eternally beautiful. In this thinking and in this way, we can get around, behind, and under the more formal structure of logic and ethics and come to the realization of this important reality of the natural ethics, the natural logic, through the simple acceptance of which we grow as we were intended to grow. Not by great pain. The lily of the field does not grow in pain. It grows in fulfillment. It grows because growth is its natural quality. Man has this same natural quality. And it is true, as the king of Israel said, looking upon the lily, that Solomon in all his glory is not arrayed like one of these. Actually, the growth of things protects these things. They do not suffer till they pause in their own growth. They do not come into pain until they resist beauty, resist truth, and resist wisdom. And when we understand that, we will have a solid ground for a great constructive approach to ethical and logical philosophy. Well, our time is up, so we'll see you next time. By the way, before I dismiss this meeting, I'd like to call to your attention that on the 8th of December at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we are having the puppet show. It's going to be a very beautiful thing, and the vendor is putting this on, the returns off for the benefit of our mortgage fund, is a well-known artist and has studied this art all over the world and brings to us two wonderful, interesting puppet legends. And I just heard recently he's also going to say a few words about the use of puppets, their construction, and how they occur on various pieces of the world. You'll find the program announcing this event in the lobby. We hope you'll all be here.